trillion in lending authority from the Fed and $3 trillion in fiscal spending approved by Congress. That's a lot of money, by his estimate, 40% of the GDP. Start us off before we get to the longer term issues by just giving us a sense of how you react to what you hear from Larry Kudlow in the White House.
Well, I think he started off by explaining that he really didn't know very much about. So he acknowledged that there was a wide range of possibilities, and that's the case. And then as he said, there could be a V and there could be a W, and who knows. And then they have to pick one, and so there's a congressional budget office. But I think the uncertainty around that is clear. There's a lot of uncertainty. Regarding the creation of the money and credit that's been produced, I think it's important to realize that for every individual, every company, and every government, there's a certain amount of revenue and income, and they have a certain amount of savings. And this economy, this downturn, produced a hole in income and a hole in balance sheets. And if those holes were not filled in, the economic consequences of that would be devastating. And so we estimate that there'll be $4 to $5 trillion, roughly speaking, in losses that come in the United States, indirectly or directly, and that the amount of filling those in quickly has made a big difference. However, it brings into question what the value of money and credit is. So there's been a lot of money and credit produced, and that will have implications longer term. So when we look beyond the immediate and we hear the sort of questions that have been asked dealing with tax cut changes and so on, I think we're going to come into an era in which the value of money, there are limits to the capacity to print money and maintain the value of money. And there are going to be questions that are capitalist versus socialist type of questions in terms of how the bill is divided and how what the world looks like in the future. Those things will take place in the future. So I think his assessment was right, but I don't think we're yet talking about the big things that we need to talk about.
We're going to turn to those big things. I just want to take one more minute to ask a more immediate question. I've heard people wonder whether what we're living through now, both the pandemic and the enormous economic dislocation of the shutdown of the world economy, should be likened to a tornado which sweeps through and does enormous damage, but then is gone, and you rebuild, or an earthquake which leaves behind rubble that can take years and years to rebuild. So I just would put that to you, Mr. Dalio, when you think about this, do either of those fit better, the tornado or the earthquake analogy?
First of all, I think that in both of those cases, they're apt. And whether we call it one or the other, there's a great deal of economic damage which will remain and will require a lot of repairing after this. I think what you mean is whether there are structural fissures and whether those will be deep. And I believe they are. And that's why I think that there are three big factors that exist today that did not exist since the 30s, that are those things that create those fissures. I think those three big things that is the setting that this downturn has happened in is, first, we have a debt monetary situation that did not exist since the war years. In other words, when interest rates hit zero and you have a lot of debt and you have to print a lot of money, that changes the game. It means that it's not easy to stimulate an economy by monetary policy in the usual way. And you have to deal with the debts, and you're in a debt monetization mode. So that's one factor that you have to go back to the 30s. The second big factor, that's the lay of the land that we will remain with, gap between socialism and capitalism and Republicans and Democrats and so on. And that wealth gap issue, when you have an economic downturn at the same time, is particularly difficult. And the third factor that didn't exist before, but it existed in the 1930s, which is a concern, is the rise of a power to challenge the existing world power, the rise of China to challenge the United States, in which case there's a lot to argue or fight about, and that's the backdrop. So a downturn would have come from one reason or another. They always come. And those structural issues are the big important issues. And the 1930s gives a good case if we look at those. And if we look at the sizes of the debt and the printing and so on, that's also as comparable to the war years. That will drive the nature of what's to come.